Today we are going to be talking about communication accommodation theory. This video was created by myself, Landon Perry. Who created communication accommodation theory? This theory was originally created by British-American social psychologist Howard Giles, but has since evolved to adopt all forms of communication, not just speech, as was originally created. How and/or why was this theory created? In the 1970s, psychologists began to create a theory that at the time was known as speech accommodation theory. The goal of this theory was to help explain the motivations behind how people's speech styles change during social encounters. It also explored how these changes in speech affected social outcomes and the consequences, both negative and positive, that could come from changing your speech to fit certain social circumstances. Over the years, this theory eventually evolved into its latest iteration, known as communication accommodation theory. The reason for this evolution was to widen its scope from just speech to overall communication as a whole. It can now be used better to understand things such as how we write text messages to our friends, or even things such as the style that online gamers use to communicate over their given platforms. There are four main parts, or basic principles, of communication accommodation theory. The first part of the theory is that communication style is not only affected by the current situation or how the person initially views the situation, but it is also affected by socio-historic context, meaning how social interactions were experienced in similar social situations in the past. The second part of the theory is that communication is not just the exchange of information, ideas, or emotions, but it can also be a way to be noticed as part of a social group or category through what is called accommodation. This is when you use an accent, certain dictation, or things such as slang to communicate to others. You speak their style of communication and are therefore part of their social group. The third part of this theory is that when you are having these interactions, that there are expected levels of accommodation to take place. These levels are usually based off of stereotypes about the non-group members in the interaction, along with what would be considered the situational and social norm, depending on the interaction. If a reasonable level of accommodation is not reached for both sides, it oftentimes leads to withdrawal from the interaction. The fourth part of the theory is that the participants in a given interaction use communication strategies to communicate different attitudes towards other social groups and other participants within their own social group. An example of this is convergence and divergence. Convergence is when people change to others' communication style to reduce their social differences, while divergence is the opposite. This is when they make their social styles purposefully stand out to differentiate themselves even more from the other's style. When it comes to communication accommodation theory, the issue and limitations that people normally run into when using this theory or strategy is that no matter how hard you try to accommodate to other groups, you won't really know how they will perceive you. Some people or groups may embrace your convergence and be more comfortable, or some could be put off by it and want you to be more divergent. This balance is really only achieved through trial and error or extensive experience with a certain social group or social situation. On the screen now, you can see the APA citations for the two articles I used for the information for the theory part of this video. I used the articles Communication Accommodation Theory, a look back, and a look ahead, and Communication Accommodation Theory. Next, we are going to discuss 3 application articles where communication accommodation theory has been used in interpersonal communication. The first article is the effects of speech rate similarity on compliance, application of communication accommodation theory. The goal of this article was to test communication accommodation theory and the effects of speech rate on compliance when presented with a request of some kind. It was predicted that people with similar speech rates would be more receptive to each other and more likely to answer their request. This is because it was hypothesized that similar speech rates would raise intimacy and immediacy levels, and that this raised intimacy and immediacy would increase the likelihood of compliance with a request for help. It was also hypothesized that good decoders, which is how fast a person can understand or conceptualize speech, would prefer faster rates than poorer decoders would. They used the theory of communication accommodation to see if by accommodating to another person's same speech rate and the rate preferences, if they would be more responsive and feel more of a connection to the other person. They did this by testing over 320 different students and performing a series of tests, including a speech rate pretest, a nonverbal sensitivity test, a speech rate preference test, and a compliance manipulation experiment. They did all of these by having students attend individual sessions where their speech rates were measured. The experimenter then put groups of students together with all different speech rates and pretended to have grabbed the wrong test for their next test. He would send someone to go get the correct test, and during this time, a recruiting tape would be played at one of the students' speech rates, and followed by some questions to test its effectiveness. Once the effectiveness questions were answered about the recruitment tape, someone would return with the correct tests, and the decoding ability test and speech rate preference tests were then taken. The results of this study showed that compliance when it comes to requests for help are linked to relational meaning. And because speech style similarity is associated with increased relational communication, that means that when using similar speech rates, it is more likely that the other person will find your relationship more meaningful and therefore be more likely to comply with your request. The second article is called "A Nonverbal Signal in Voices of Interview Partners Effectively Predicts Communication Accommodation and Social Status Perceptions." The goal of this article is to test how social and economic status can affect voice convergence. 3 hypotheses are made. The first is that interview partners' voices will converge from the lower frequency band of their voices. The second is that voice convergence and communication accommodation are controlled by the partner's social status, specifically that the partner with the higher social status will be accommodated to by the person with the lower social status. The third hypothesis is by looking at the result of the second hypothesis and determining who is converging to who, you can predict how each person in the interview personally views their own social status. They tested these hypotheses by viewing multiple different people talking to Larry King and comparing their social status to how they used communication accommodation to adjust to King. The conclusion of the experiments were that the greater the speaker's need to gain social approval, the greater the degree of convergence that there will be for that person. So it is not directly aligned with their social status, but how they personally view their own social status compared to the person they are talking to. The third article is called "Politeness Accommodation in Electronic Mail." There were 3 main goals in this article. The first was to find if people would accommodate to politeness in email messages by converging to verbal markers such as please and thank you. Would they use the same polite response? The second was to find if people would converge to structural elements in emails, such as how the introduction was presented or how the closing remarks were written at the end of the email. The third was to find if these 2 verbal and structural pieces in emails show how individuals overly accommodate to politeness in email messages or other messages over digital space. They used communication accommodation theory to see if accommodation is the main reason for the way emails are written to people. They did this by taking students and telling them they had to email a visiting professor and seeing if they would base their communication style over email to how the visiting professor would later respond to their original message. The results from this study supported the idea that communication accommodation theory is present in computer-based communication, and it could be seen that convergence was taking place when an email response was given and the following message reflected the structure and politeness cues of the email that they had received. My game is called the Communication Accommodation Theory game. To start, a group of 15 or more kids get into groups of 5 based off of who they are closest with. Once you're in your friend groups, you will talk to your friends for 5 minutes just to get comfortable and warm up everyone for conversation. If groups have trouble talking, the teacher or leader of the game can prompt groups periodically with conversation topics. These can be anything. Once the 5 minutes is up, each group will send their most social person to another group in a rotating fashion. So after the same number of rotations happen as the number of groups, the person they sent will return to their own group. Each rotation will be 5 minutes and will consist of the group having casual conversation and the new person who joined the group trying to use communication accommodation theory to fit in with the group as much as possible. Once the 5 minutes is up, the people sent will rotate to the next group, and the previous group will rank how their interaction was from 1 to 5, based on the outside member, based off of how they accommodated to the group and how the group received their accommodations. Once everyone rotates through each team, the winner will be decided by the overall total rank that all the groups gave their outside person. The winner will be crowned the ultimate communication accommodator. You can then restart the game by sending a new person from your groups. The requirements for the game are simply a piece of paper for keeping score, a writing utensil, the want to meet new people, 100% honesty, and a group of 5 friends preferably. The rules for this game are no showing each other your ranks. The ranks go between 1 and 5, 5 being best and 1 being the worst. The ranks are also based off of social compatibility and their ability to accommodate. This game was chosen because it gives people the opportunity to actively use communication accommodation theory and easily see how it can affect how others think of them. They will be forced to be in a lot of different friend groups within a somewhat odd social circumstance and must adapt to fit in with people who may not socially act the same as them. It will also show how many people naturally use communication accommodation theory without even thinking about it, and how they are very good at using convergence and divergence to find their own balance within a group. The next section are possible exam questions. They are all short answer and there's 5 of them. Question 1. Define communication accommodation theory in your own words. Example, answer. Communication accommodation theory is the act of changing your own communication style to fit someone else's or another group's style so that you fit in better or they are more comfortable with you. Question 2. Give an example of how you personally have used communication accommodation theory in your life. Example answer. When I'm with my parents' friends, I'm a much tamer social drinker. I will casually sip on a beer or glass of wine while keeping low and quiet conversation. This is communication accommodation because I act how they act as compared to how I would typically act as a college student at the bars here at Purdue. Question 3. What are the 4 assumptions of communication theory? Example answer. Communication style is affected by socio-historic context. Communication is a way to be noticed as part of a social group. There are expected levels of accommodation. Participants use communication strategies to communicate different attitudes towards other groups. Those are the 4 assumptions of communication theory. Question 4. After seeing the application articles presented, what article did you personally find most impactful to yourself and society? Example answer. I found the email and digital communication article the most impactful because it shows how even in non-face-to-face interactions, we still use communication accommodation theory regularly. Question number 5. This is an opinion or thought-provoking question. Do you think that we are better off naturally using communication accommodation, or are we pretending and not being our true selves when we use it? Example answer. I believe we are better off having communication accommodation because it shows that we can adapt as a society and communicate in a proper manner no matter what our differences or situations are. And that is my video on communication accommodation theory. Listed now in APA format are my scholarly articles used in this presentation.